I have some good news and some bad news to share with you. I'm going to start with the bad news. We were supposed to have Trudy Rubin speak here tonight. I called her up this morning and she said that she had a sore throat and didn't think that she could speak because she was doing a podcast on Friday and wanted to save her voice. But I called up our dear friend, who's a friend to many people in this building, Jerry Sorkin. And he was absolutely gracious, and he's going to talk to us tonight. So for those of you who don't know Jerry, let me tell you about him. He's a Middle East and North African specialist. He got his undergraduate and graduate degree at Penn. He believes that dialogue is the way you deal with conflict resolution. And he has organized many events that brought professionals together from opposing sides to get them to talk to each other and break through cultural and political barriers. A number of years ago, he organized a group in Israel of prominent Jewish leaders, and they met with Yasser Arafat, and he facilitated that whole thing. He has served as tourism consultant to the World Bank, the European Union, and director in Tunisia of George Washington's University's tourism studies. After living 6 years in Tunisia, Jerry returned to Philadelphia in 2016, and he founded and serves as president of Iconic Journeys Worldwide. He oversees their programs ranging from Tunisia, Algeria, Cuba, Morocco, Argentina, Iran, Israel, Palestinian territories. A couple of years ago, he started taking people to Lebanon. He is an adjunct lecturer at Temple University, and a number of you have taken courses with him on the Middle East. In July 2018, he was appointed by Tunisia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs to serve as that country's honorary consul to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I really appreciate that Jerry is pinch hitting tonight, but it's not pinch hitting. He's really terrific. I know you will all enjoy hearing him. He's going to talk about the situation in Israel.
Well, the first giveaway probably was that I wasn't wearing a skirt tonight. But I was supposed to be in Tunisia leading a group of 17 people. So perhaps it was fortuitous for all of us, both for my friend Trudy Rubin and the Philadelphia, that I was here. Thank you all and others who had anything to do with louder. Oh, so thank you for Dr. Stillman and anyone else who was involved in planning. I know you've been having a series of talks. So I'm happy to be here. This is a building that I think anyone in Philadelphia is probably familiar with. And it's also, I'm glad you're not at the Phillies game, but here tonight. Having been asked to replace tonight's speaker, my friend Trudy Rubin, the worldview columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, was both an honor but at an unsettling time. But I appreciated that Dr. Stillman asked me. My first thoughts were, it was a topic that's so upsetting to me that I didn't know if I could take up the invitation to respond. Thousands of deaths these past few weeks, both for Israelis and Palestinians, have been very painful to me. And I have had tours going in the next month to the one I was going to be in Morocco, Tunisia, Israel, Algeria. I'm trying to think where else, Lebanon, all canceled. So it's an unsettling time for a lot of people, obviously, because people just did not feel comfortable going. I want to start off by reading something that was sent to me on Facebook by someone who he's an Israeli born. He very entrepreneurial person who started a small hotel in Nazareth, which many of you probably know is an Arab city, the largest Arab city in Israel. And he started with a Palestinian partner. And I'm sorry as I read this, I get a little emotional. I just received it this morning, and it made me say, this is the place to be tonight. I'm just going to quote. On the morning of October 7th, I woke up around 7:30 a.m. to find a message on our family's WhatsApp group from my parents explaining they heard sirens and moved into their safe room. As they often face threats and hear sirens where they live, I wasn't immediately worried. By the way, they live right near the Gaza border. I made my morning coffee and turned on the news. This is when I learned that Hamas was intruding on Israeli villages and became worried. I immediately called my father. It was 7:35 a.m. He picked up and told me, yes, Maoz, we are in the safe room, we are shooting, but that's it. I called him again 10 minutes later, just after 7:45. Excuse me. Now that my father and my mother picked up, I've not heard from them again. Now I'm a peace activist. Perhaps it was not what I was meant to be, but that's the death my parents made me. There is an understanding in my family that we must keep thinking, that we must keep our parents' legacy. My parents were people of peace. They did not care about anyone's race, age, or color. They treated everyone equally. They treated everyone as they wanted to be treated. They were people of hope. So I've now become a peace activist to keep alive their legacy. Today, Israel is repeating. I apologize for my respond my emotional response. Today, Israel, I got this around 1 o'clock today. Today, Israel is repeating an old mistake it made many times in the last century. We must stop it. Revenge is not going to bring back the parents. It is not going to bring back other Israelis or Palestinians who have been killed. It's going to do the opposite. It's going to cause more casualty. It's going to cause more death. We must break the cycle. Today, I'm crying for everyone, every single human being suffering because of this bloody cycle. I'm against blame games. I'm against efforts to determine who has more victims, who is suffering the most. We are all suffering. Let's focus on stopping the suffering. Hamas killed my parents, but Israel's war isn't the answer. Let's stop this war. Maoz, he lives between Tel Aviv and Haifa. And I just typed in his name on Google, and you'll see it every news bureau between the BBC, NBC, ABC, everyone has since interviewed him. So after reading that, and I got that around 1 o'clock, and as I said, I was thinking, how can I replace Trudy, who has been a friend for years? And Trudy and I first met, you may not even remember this, we met in 1983 in the West Bank. She was with the Christian Science Monitor at the time. She was just leaving an appointment at Birzeit University, which is a Palestinian university. And I was just about to go in to meet the person who she had just come out from me. So that's how Trudy and I met. We found then our cause was the same. How do we, that's a journalist, but like her, is how do you make humanity out of what's taking place? So as I thought about that, and thought about this, what I received from my friends in Israel, I thought it was particularly important that I come and replace Trudy since she was unavailable, because I think we all have to reflect on what's happened the last couple of weeks. I also started to think why all these years when I've been studying to learn to speak Hebrew and Arabic, which I do. Why I've been going and leading so many organizations over the years to meet with both Israelis and Palestinians together. Why I have led so many trips to the region and developed close friends with Israelis, Palestinians, and other Arabs. And why did I choose to live in the Arab world for 6 years as a Jew who never shied away from letting it be known that I was Jewish? I thought speaking tonight was the way of helping make sense of all this. Excuse me. My years have been dedicated to try and play a constructive role as I felt I could in my own way and with my own ideas, like a constructive role between Palestinians and Israelis and between Jews and Arabs who wanted to learn with objectivity by teaching, writing, and leading many travel programs throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Following the decades of hate, death, and destruction, helping others to humanize those who, like myself, strongly condemn the actions of Hamas on October 7th, but also must condemn decades of treatment of Palestinians under certain Israeli policies. I'll add something that Paul has shared about my organizing a group to meet with Yasser Arafat. That was before Oslo, when everyone had hoped Arafat would be the next Mandela. Unfortunately, he was not in the end, but that was the purpose of organizing a trip to meet Arafat. When I walked in the room with 6 or 7 very active American Jews, he came out. It was the strangest meeting I ever had, a fascinating meeting. He didn't know a lot about me other than obviously I knew some people who must have said, this Jerry Sorkin, he's an okay guy. We can have him meet with us. And it was at a secret location in Tunisia. And when he walked into the room, after we waited about an hour for him to come, I greeted him in Arabic and he was shocked. And his colleagues expressed the fact that you're all Jews and this guy's speaking Arabic. And it was probably one of the most amazing 45 minutes of discussion that I ever had. Unfortunately, he didn't have the backbone that we all had hoped. Under the Clinton administration, no one had visited President Clinton in the White House more than Yasser Arafat. So I was not some leftist idealist. I was someone who was a realist. As was Clinton. Many of us had hoped that he would show a sense of humanity, which he did not in the end. He didn't have the backbone to say to his own people what he was saying to Clinton and Dennis Ross and others in English. Be that as it may, I decided this is why it's important to speak to audiences like yourselves. The blame game doesn't help. Everyone rewrites history in their own way. I have some very close Palestinian friends who I've spoken to since the 7th of October, who have been very honest with me in condemning what Hamas has done. Hamas doesn't represent them. Hamas also doesn't represent the little babies and women and mothers and grandmothers who have been either killed by bombs or who have been taken hostage by the Palestinians. So Hamas is not Palestinian, is not representing every Palestinian. And it's important that we know that they have the same interest as Israeli, the normal Israeli. Bring up their children, teach them the right thing, let them live their life and have an enjoyable life. There's always people on both sides who don't teach their kids that, but I think we have to look forward to what's next. Right now, poised on Gaza are 300,000 Israeli soldiers. And I think when President Biden last week was in Israel, I'm sure he said to Benjamin Netanyahu, please don't go in there. Please don't go in now. We'll never get hostages out. You're going to have a bloodbath of Israelis. And in the end, what is it really going to accomplish? So think about what you do before you go in. There's right and wrong on all sides, that's for sure. I have seen it. I've seen how people have responded to me in the Arab world, particularly Palestinians, when they first meet me and find out that I'm Jewish. And I've never hid that fact. Usually comes about when they hear me speaking Arabic. Where did you learn Arabic? What's your background? And I never wanted to hide my background. Rather, I felt by being honest with them, I'm the Jew in their territory. I'm the Jew living in their country. I'm the Jew living in their West Bank's town. And I'm there to try and talk with them. And I've never received so much respect as a result of those efforts. And respect is what's been missing for decades of both sides. Recognizing that a doctor coming down here this morning or this afternoon on NPR is talking about having over 100 babies in the neonatal ward and what's going to happen if the Israelis come in or we don't get any more supplies and the energy is all gone and we're being told to take these 130 babies and move them to the south of Lebanon. What does it mean for the Israeli who's just lost his family or knows that they've been taken by Hamas without any idea of whether they're alive? Well, we'll come back. What's next? So I think it's very important for all of us who follow this region to understand there's two sides to every situation. Many of them are right, many of them are wrong. And many people like to be revisionist in how they describe these situations. But what has to be decided more than anything right now is where do we go? Where do the Palestinians and Israelis go in the future to keep this from happening? How do we tell our friends and families who perhaps travel to Israel, travel to Arab countries, how do we tell them that they can feel a sense of security and trust? And I think more than anything else, if anything should come of all of this, it will hopefully be in the lessons and the opening up of our minds to the fact that there is another way of doing things. But going into a war and escalating right now is probably going to only bring lots of death and bring up more young kids who today are 8 or 9 in Gaza who will look forward to being the next members of Hamas. So I'm going to stop at that to give questions, and I apologize for my emotional response on it tonight. But I think it's very important that we try and put a perspective on this that will help maybe make sense and make something positive come out of the ashes of this. There are many people who will never be coming back. Their families will never see them, and that's on both sides. And I can't blame a 6-year-old Palestinian kid. I can't blame a 6-year-old Israeli kid for what's taking place right now. But the people who are old enough to think through it and try and be understanding and respectful of the other side, just in the way that I've told you. People were responsive to me when I acknowledged my Jewishness, but spoke to them in their language. Speaking in Arabic for a foreigner is not like speaking in Spanish or French, because when you speak in Arabic, it shows the other person that you're not just conversing and knowing the words and knowing the vocabulary, but it shows you've taken time to understand them as a people. And this is particularly important. And this is why I've spent many years trying to improve on my Arabic, my Hebrew. So I'm conversant in both. And I must tell you, I have true friends among Palestinians and Arabs, and lived among them for over 6 years. And there is humanity out there. We just have to encourage them. So on that note, I'm going to stop and take any questions and answers to my. Any questions that any of you have or comments? Yes, the gentleman in the back.
Thank you. I'm Jim Rosenstein. Your heartfelt comments are very much appreciated and understood. But what I don't understand, and I think virtually no one else understands, is how this situation can be resolved on an ongoing basis if Hamas continues to exercise its control over at least that portion of the Palestinian community, so they can't find a peaceful way to coexist with the Israelis.
I completely agree with you on that. That's a tough question. That's a tough dilemma the Israelis are in. It's a tough dilemma for President Biden and the many other Western leaders who are trying to contain the situation so it doesn't become more volatile than it is. I'm a believer that Hamas has to be destroyed, which is what Benjamin Netanyahu and others are saying every day. But you know, they have great intelligence, so it wasn't there this time. They have great inroads into the Palestinian community. If any of you have watched Fauda on television, it's quite realistic because I know people of that intelligence network on both sides. And it's amazing, in my opinion, it's a very realistic show. But your point is well taken. What do you do with Hamas? And I think the Israelis have the ability to take care of them. But before you have more Hamas or more adherence to Hamas, you also have to say, is it really right that to visit Ramallah, to visit Nablus, to visit Hebron, that you have to go through a checkpoint? And if you're a Palestinian, if you want to leave and work at a job, assuming you've been given permission to work at that job, 10 minutes outside of Ramallah, 10 minutes outside of Hebron. So there's a lot of reflection that I think has to take place. I don't think there'll be any tears shed for Hamas if they're attacked, but it's going to be a bigger problem that will come. And how do you deal with that? Yes.
Thank you. Lita Cohen, would you talk about Jewish ethics, rules of war, Jewish ethical standards concerning discretionary actions and what the rules under Jewish law are of war and what is permissible and meeting standards and what is not?
I can't put myself out there as a specialist on war and Jewish ethics. I can say that I grew up in a religious home in St. Louis. I went to yeshiva 3 days a week. We used to walk to synagogue on Saturday. And my first visit to Israel was when I was 16, and no one in my family had ever traveled. So my parents said, and they didn't have the funds to send me, but I was just dying to go. I wanted to go to Israel. So my parents said, well, if you could save the money, get a job and save the money, you can go. There's lots of programs. So I was 15 years old and got a job at a place called Chicken Delight. I don't know if they're around anymore. And finally I said to my parents, I have the money for the trip. So I went on the trip, and I remember there was a young rabbi who was Orthodox. He was with us on the trip. And it seemed to be a great trip. This was in you all probably think I'm 45, 48. Well, this was in 1969, 2 years after the Six-Day War. I was 16 years old, so you could do the math. I remember we came to Jerusalem. We had been traveling, and we got to Jerusalem. And if you remember, 1967 is when the Israelis got back the West Bank from Jordan and parts of Jerusalem that no Israelis were able to go to. And I remember we pulled up to this area of what was East Jerusalem to go see some of the sites. And there were little Arab kids who were selling chiclets or candies. And the rabbi said, don't let them bother you, just swish them away. And I thought, I was going to yeshiva after school every day. This is the rabbi who I study with. And are these that I'm 16-year-old and these little kids, what do they know? So I'm not a specialist on Jewish ethics, but I know it opened up my eyes, not just to them, but it made me think I've got to learn the other side. And it was that situation that prompted me to decide to study Arabic so that I can know who these people are. How are we so different? And I've made countless trips back and forth to the region. I was supposed to go this February, leading a group, which I'm sure won't happen now. But I knew those were not the Jewish ethics that my family brought me up to know. Not to treat a 6-year-old or 5-year-old selling candies with that tone of voice. So I wish I could tell you something that was more halakhic in what is the right ethics, but I could tell you what the ethics were that I grew up with. And those are not what I learned in my Jewish household from my parents, who were also teachers in the Jewish system. So, yes.
Is there any hope for the Palestinians?
Do you feel, in your opinion, that there's any hope from Palestinian leadership or Arab leadership in some of the Arab countries to help bring down Hamas so that the Palestinians can have some kind of peace when the Arabs and the Jews can get together?
I think it's a great question. Until 1967, Gaza was under the control of Egypt. The last thing, Egypt has one of these last 2 weeks, which is why I think it's been so difficult to bring in convoys of medicine, food, whatever aid. Because the last thing is the Egyptians want is to open that gate and find Gazans flooding into Egypt and having to deal with them again. The PLO was kicked out of Jordan in the mid-70s because there was something called Black September, where they rose up against the Bedouin troops of the king, and it became essentially a civil war. And they were put out of Jordan, and the last thing his son, King Abdullah, wants, and I'm friendly with one of his daughters as well. The last thing they want is to see Palestinians suffer, but on the other hand, they don't want them back. So what's the solution they do? The Lebanese, I was just in Lebanon for a couple of weeks in May. If you probably all recall that 1982, the Israelis invaded Lebanon because they were constantly being shelled by Palestinians because the PLO was controlling much of, not even Hamas so much, but the PLO was controlling a lot of Lebanon. They set up checkpoints throughout the country. So if you wanted to go to one part of Lebanon from another to trade your belongings or wherever it was, the PLO was there to take the taxation. Or they controlled the ports. And no one in Lebanon is basically, if you haven't read the news about Lebanon the last 20 years, it's a state that is a failed state. So the Lebanese, as the government, they've never been able to do much about it, but the last thing they want is to see the PLO replaced by a Hezbollah shelling troops in the south and in the north of Israel. Oddly enough, as intimidated as the Lebanese are, Hezbollah is part of the government. They're part of the parliamentary system. And when you travel to the south of Lebanon, the uniforms all look the same as the Lebanese army, but you see the Hezbollah patch. So the Lebanese, I can tell you right now, particularly the Christian villages in the south, are frightened that if Hezbollah starts shelling the Israelis will do what they need to do, which is shell back. And bombs and missiles don't distinguish who's a peacenik, who's a Christian, who's a Muslim. It just shells. So I think the answer is every Arab leader wants to do something to curtail this. And I think that's why there's been the assistance that there has been from places like Qatar, from Egypt, from King Abdullah in Jordan, and the King of Morocco, which is where I'm supposed to be today. I think they want to stop it. I think they want to put Hamas in its place, just like the Israelis do. But it's not an easy thing to do, and they have the Arab Street to contend with. And if you've been reading the last couple of weeks, demonstrations have been everywhere in every capital in the last 2 weeks. And I'm sure that the leaders of the Arab countries are doing all they can to contain those. I'm sure what their strategy is, let them vent, let them be on the main street of town and vent, which is better than letting them take up arms. So I think the leadership has to come, and not all these people are real leaders, but I think it has to come from among the Arab world first, so that they show some type of leadership that will help curtail this. Yes.
You speak in terms of the leadership referencing Lebanon, Jordan, etc. Isn't the real problem Iran?
Oh, definitely.
And you can get all the cooperation you want from these other countries, but as long as the Iranians continue their present course of conduct, what hope is there?
I think the Iranians are a major problem. But they're going to be there. They're not, people talk about, well, should we go in and attack the Iranians? Iraq was a cakewalk for the US troops. Afghanistan was a cakewalk after 9/11. Iran will not be the same. So I believe you're not going to be able to change the minds of the Iranian leaders by trying to come in with military, because they are a pretty well-developed military. And you can see from the last couple of weeks, they've certainly been doing a lot of homework on how to develop missile systems. Iran is a real wild card. And I hope and pray that they can be contained in some way. They work through proxies for the most part. Hezbollah, Hamas, these are proxies, Islamic Jihad. And again, in response to the gentleman in the back, there'll be no tears shed from me if something happens to the leadership of Hamas. But still, you have to go on somewhere, and Iran is there, and to inflame them is not going to be helpful, because they are not going to sit back.
Barbara Forer, we read about the tunnels that Hamas has built with billions of dollars. And I haven't heard anything in practically a week as to Israelis attacking the tunnels and making any progress in blowing them up. Do you have any information?
You're thinking that I have more power than I do. This is the big problem. They've been getting a lot of donor money, the Palestinians, over these last 20, 30 years, particularly since the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993. Donor nations giving hundreds of millions of dollars. And I think when the Abraham Accords, which I think are terrific, when they came about, and Dubai, or the Emirates, and Morocco, Bahrain, when they were willing to sign the accords with Israel, I think that signals something. And they actually, in some cases, said it. We've been giving hundreds of millions of dollars to the Palestinians all these years. And if they're using it to build tunnels and things of this nature, then we're mistaken. And the fact that Saudi Arabia seems to be getting very close to also perhaps joining these accords. And they've been very quiet these last 2 weeks, all these countries. You haven't been hearing much criticism from them about what the Israelis are doing in terms of responding. So I think what we're seeing is the Arab leaders, and this is kind of in response to you, I think they're seeing that this time they're going to take their hands off, but they want to try and keep control in some way so that it doesn't go out of proportion. But it's, these tunnels are all there, and that's probably where a lot of these hostages are being held. So what can the Israelis do? It would be a bloodbath for the Israelis to go into these narrow alleys of Gaza, where snipers can be on, a building can be bombed out, but you have a snipers on top of them, or going into an area where you don't know where a tunnel is. The Israelis are smart. They'll find a way to find some of these tunnels, and they've been able to assassinate a number of the Hamas leaders in the last 2 weeks. I think we just have to hope and pray that they continue doing it in the way they know how to do it, but without a major escalation. Yes.
Whatever one.
Paul, you want to bring the microphone? Oh, I'm sorry. Don't get that. We'll do
Okay,
you afterwards. Okay.
excuse me.
Oh, no, you're, okay.
Okay,
I apologize.
coincidentally, Trudy Rubin had a column in Anchor today, referencing exactly what you were just saying. The general Palestinian populace does not want to be governed by Hamas. They don't want that suppressed government. Why doesn't, with the numbers, why don't they try to overturn Hamas? They tried in China, they tried in Iran, at least they made an effort. Why isn't anything being done now?
Well, I think the big question for all the Palestinians as well as others, who is going to be the replacement? If you get rid of Hamas right now, who's going to rise up and replace them? I don't know if you remember, if all of you remember why Hamas is even in charge of Gaza, but under George Bush Sr., he really pushed this idea of having democracy spread throughout the Middle East. So they were really, I was living overseas at the time, and I remember hearing a lot about what was going on, but I had access to NPR, New York Times, and a lot of things that the average person in the world will never read. So they know, I can tell you, it's a very slanted view of what they hear, unfortunately. Hamas, George Senior Bush, wanted to see elections held. Well, there was no surprise that the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, Arafat, and all were very corrupt. If you go to Ramallah, there's nothing but burned out cars and trash when you drive through it, but you'll see these villas as well. And you wonder, who's living in these villas? Who wants to drive through trash every day? But it's often the leaders who have made a fortune from, again, donor money comes in, but it's money's fungible. So there's been a lot of corrupt leaders in the Palestinian organizations. So under Bush, it was pushed, have a vote, have an election. And this was to happen in Gaza as well. But the Gazans voted overwhelmingly for Hamas. Not because they wanted Hamas, but because they thought Hamas, who declares and says that they are a religious organization as opposed to Fatah, which is secular. And I think the Arab Street and the Palestinians, one, were intimidated by Hamas, but two, I think they felt they're going to finally get someone who's not going to take all that money that's coming in. And there was a lot after the Oslo Accords. There were hundreds of millions of dollars coming in to help rebuild. But Hamas, we saw what happened in 2005 when the Israelis pulled out of Gaza, giving them all this farming that's been done by the Israelis, giving them opportunities to now have a head start to rebuild Gaza and make it a Dubai. But they didn't do it. And it's primarily because the Hamas leaders didn't want to see that happen. So again, we can't predict who will be there, but there hasn't been anyone who has come up publicly who could be a good replacement. there are people among the Palestinians, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, who probably would say, I can't stand these guys. I wish I was able to rise up, but unfortunately, when you rise up in those societies, you're quickly put in jail or something happens. So again, this is where it's a very touchy thing. I really have to commend the American leadership, Tony Blinken, Biden, and many of the European leaders who are really trying to keep things to be at a sensible level of dialogue. Talk is the only way you can improve things, and talk doesn't always work, but it's certainly going to do a lot better than a big escalation of arms. So.
You had mentioned that you thought that many of the Arab leaders didn't like Hamas, and we said, are they doing anything to get rid of Hamas? And if they're not, what is to stop this from happening again unless Israel does something?
Obviously, Israel has to do something, and Israel has done pretty well in terms of containing them all these years, but also the Israeli policies that the Palestinians have lived under is what has infuriated many people and helped something like Hamas develop. Again, I give the analogy, and a lot of people don't like to hear it, but if you visit any Palestinian town in the West Bank, you can't go. Most people in the West Bank under 30 years old have never been to the Mediterranean. And by car, it's half an hour. But they haven't even seen the sea. They haven't seen the sea. It's a very tough question. But the Israelis are wise, and they've done a lot of things that have shown that they have ingenuity, and certainly that they have great intelligence. In this case, October 7th didn't show that. I think if I could be critical, I think Netanyahu has had his focus on developing this far right-wing group to have a judicial system that didn't require a judicial system, but rather was relying on some very extreme right-wing people. Yes.
Esther Schwartz.
Okay. Also, Paul, I would say there's two gentlemen up here who will be trying to speak. So, but yes, Mrs. Short.
At 6 o'clock this evening, I watched channels 12, PBS, RWHYY. And for the first 10 to 15 minutes, I saw coverage of Gaza hospitals, children on the ground, talk of children missing limbs, etc. Then there was a switch to what was happening in Israel, a couple of interviews there. But I found the first 15 minutes so one-sided, so slanted towards this one part of a two-part drama. I'm wondering, is there a way that we can in some way even out this coverage? It was definitely biased. And I think the bottom line is that Hamas inflicted this on their own people. That doesn't mean children should suffer, but Hamas inflicted this on their own population. What can we do?
I do agree that Hamas inflicted on their own people. I don't think Hamas was really caring about all these children because they knew what the Israeli response would be. But I can tell you that I know a number of the reporters from NPR, and one who you hear every morning from Jerusalem, Daniel Esther, who is a good friend of mine. He doesn't, the public doesn't know, but he's Jewish, grew up in a very Jewish household, speaks Hebrew and speaks Arabic. And I know that his colleagues who are the NPR people based in the West Bank, he introduced them to me and we've become quite friendly. Coincidentally, the husband is a collector of Oriental rugs, which I've been as well in my life. And it's interesting where you find the binds that bring people together. And I just got a note from them the other day because I reached out to tell them how difficult time was finding it, watching, and they said they really appreciated hearing from me about that. I don't think it's that you didn't get to see a equal view on WHOI, but you know, Hamas is not letting I don't know of any American media company who's been able to get the people into Gaza reporting, because Hamas probably doesn't want to report on what's happening. They want to tell their story. There was something in a number of years ago where there was a scene from a hospital of people taking what they said were dead babies, taking them into the hospitals after some shelling from the Israelis. Reports came out later that this was staged. I can't tell you whether it was staged or not, but I can tell you that the Arab media is not balanced. The reason when I came back to Philadelphia that I wanted to teach a course at Temple wasn't because of the big salaries they pay. That I can assure you. I felt there was something important about letting people know both sides. And all the years that I've traveled to these regions, I have friends who have PhDs from American universities and gone back to live. They don't spend their day listening to NPR or reading the New York Times and trying to figure out if it's balanced. They have the Arab media. That's what they know. And the Arab media in all the countries is biased, unfortunately, and one-sided. You'll never hear a kind word about something good that Israel did. Never. So this is a problem. The media is very slanted. And what we see of it turns out ultimately be slanted if it's shown at all, as in the case of there's no one from NPR, not any Americans who are in Gaza now. There is a Gaza representative, but they have not been able to speak very freely. So again, this is part of what we have to accept, and maybe at a better time, they can be taught how to do things. There are many journalists from the Arab world who've been brought with American dollars, USAID and State Department money, to bring them here to go to universities on programs so they learn how to report objectively. But it doesn't mean when they get back, if Hamas is in charge or Mahmoud is in charge, that he'll allow them to exercise what they learned here. You know, even now in the West Bank, if you criticize Mahmoud Abbas as a journalist, he'll be in jail. So I'm not an apologist for that, but that happens to be the fact. So it's up to us to kind of try and read both sides and look at both sides and think what's probably really happening. So this is generally.
Does this work? Yeah.
Yes.
It just seems as if everyone in Hamas died tomorrow, I'm still not seeing a way forward, given the policies of the things the Israeli government's been doing. I mean, I was just over there a few months ago. Part of our trip took us to the Palestinian areas, and the settlement policy is just atrocious. I mean, they call them settlements, but they're actually new cities.
Right.
I mean, when they talk about colonization and so on and so forth, that's a real thing. And so Israel has its own problems. How are they? And they were, before the Hamas attack, they were getting into serious political problems. What's the way forward?
I agree with you. That's why what I was saying before we turned it over to Q&A, I think both sides have to reflect on how do you move forward. And if you can't respect the other side, you don't have to bless the other side. But both sides have to understand one another, that what's happening now is not going to help. Putting people, most of the deaths, or a lot of the deaths in the last 2 weeks in the West Bank were from settlers who went on a rampage and no one's policing them. So this is not, when I said earlier, this is not right versus wrong or good versus evil. There's right and wrong on both sides.
Yeah.
And I think from the editorials that have been in the papers, in the New York Times and other places in the last few weeks, I think Netanyahu is gonna have a real reckoning among many Israelis who wonder, how did it get so out of hand? And then how was it not recognized by intelligence? So, you know, I hope and pray that there's not an escalation, that somehow cooler minds can prevail and at least start talking. And I think it will take the influence of a lot of the Arab leaders who we briefly mentioned to kind of pull together, which is something they normally haven't done. But they did pull together about the Abraham Accords, and hopefully they can pull together and there can be some positive direction discussed as a strategy of where do you go from here. But we have to just hope that that's the direction, because there's right and wrong on both sides. Yes.
Is there any role that you think the Egyptian government has to play, even if it's behind the scenes, and if so, what would that be?
I think they're playing probably a very important role right now. I think both they and the Qataris are the only reason there have been these 4 hostages who've been allowed, 2 today, if you didn't hear it on the news, and 2 from a few days ago. I think had it not been for these Arab leaders working, that I think Anthony Blinken and George Bush have been constantly trying to get them to come along on this viewpoint. And Joe Biden, what did I say? Oh, definitely Joe Biden, not Bush. I think this is why it's been such intense diplomatic efforts on the part of Americans and other European leaders, because I think that has to be the direction. You've got to, and I think fortunately, I see the president of Egypt is trying to do that. You know, people say he's an autocrat, and he is, but he's doing what he probably feels is the right thing, because Egypt has seen terrorism before. And as much as his policies can be tough, that's what you have to curtail. I lived in Tunisia when there was an autocracy, a dictator of over 20 years, and then I was living there through the whole time of the so-called Arab Spring and the revolutions. We're talking about a different society. They play by different rules. And I think that's why we need people who are diplomats, be they European or be they American. And I think they've all been trying very hard to work with people like Assisi and the Qataris and probably even the Saudis, because they've all, as I said a little while ago, they've all these Arab countries have been pretty quiet here about certainly not criticizing Israel, not praising Israel, but not criticizing them. And they have criticized Hamas. So hopefully, though, there's a breed of Arab leaders out there who can work with the Western leaders to help bring a better solution in the months ahead. But if there's an escalation, you're just going to create new Hamas members who might be 7 or 8 years old today. But they'll remember that they saw their family, you know, killed in explosions, or the house they lived in was crumbled beneath them. So it's a tough question, but it takes pretty strong minds to move forward in a positive way.
We're gonna entertain 3 more questions and then we'll end. And if you would stay a little bit for personal questions.
Sir, given your previous statements, Arab countries hate Hamas. They don't want Israeli retribution. What about the idea that the Arab countries join together, aside from Iran, because they're not
Arab.
join in,
They're also not Arab.
and work through the UN to combat Hamas? So as an Arab and NATO perhaps military might go in, but UN establish a government for governing the Palestinians as a neutral party for a limited time.
I think that's one way they can be very constructive. You know, I don't know if any of you have been to the Golan Heights. You go to the very north, you can see the UN troops, and you can look over to see Jordan and Syria. And I think the UN, while they're not a military force, They may carry arms, but they're not a military force. I think they've been trying to do that. But I'll also give you an example. I mentioned that I felt Fauda is very realistic. I have a very good Israeli friend who just retired from military service. I think he's 48, 49. When Assad was bombing his own people in the south, my friend, he's a high-ranking officer, he organized something where at night they would open the gates, the Israelis would open the gates to the Syrian border, bring in wounded Syrians, bring them to the hospitals in northern Israel, and they were treated for free. And they would send back food with them. So these type of gestures are very important, and they go on more often, I think, than many of us know. But this is what has to happen. These type of things have to happen. Because otherwise, again, you're going to just raise new Hamas members. And no one wants to see that.
Jerry, thank you. John,
John,
good to see you again.
As you know, I thought I would be in Morocco, as I told you on the phone.
I know. Yeah, thank you. I'm jealous. I came back from Spain with Barbara recently, so I'm just trying to catch up on the news. One comment, it amazed me, Jerry, that the failure of intelligence by Mossad and the other agencies, this is my comment, it blew me away that it happened. Does anyone think in the top levels of the Israeli government that there was a mole or a secret source because they knew the tunnels, they got in, and anything else? I'd like your thoughts on that, please.
I think it was New York Times, but one of the papers that has good journalists on the ground implied that very thing, that maybe there was a mole somewhere, or somehow, you know, it came out to someone, because their intelligence, the Israeli intelligence, is normally outstanding. But also Netanyahu clearly had his mind on other things, and those distractions, and that's why he suddenly finds that he has to be part of a unity government now that includes Israeli military people who probably said, you know, you screwed up. So now we have to get involved to save our people and save our country. No problem.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You gave me the answer I wanted you to.
Thank you, John.
Hello, Patricia Stewart. Is there any hope for a two-state solution, or is it too late now?
You know, a lot of people have written the death notes of the Oslo Accords, which were based on a two-state solution. The alternative to a two-state solution would be a one-state solution. And if you're going to do a one-state solution, then you have to give the rights to everyone in that one state, because right now, essentially, there is one geographic state, but not everyone has the same rights. So either there has to be a decision to make a one-state solution, everyone can vote, everyone can, but I don't think the Israelis would agree to that. So I think there's going to have to be some type of two-state solution. And, you know, a two-state solution is partly, this is just my own thinking and speaking with Palestinian friends who I think are being candid with me, but wouldn't say it very publicly. Sometimes all they want is to have a state in name. It could be small, but if they can have a passport that lets them travel. I did something 2 years ago with the group. I arranged to have 5 university students from between Birzeit University and Najaf University, which is in Naples. And I arranged this to a Palestinian friend of mine. I said, bring me 5 students. We have a group coming. But let's do it at a restaurant, because I tried to do the same thing at Birzeit University, the university welcomed me to do it, where we had a forum and there were 5 students. But every time a question from the audience was asked to the students, the professor interrupted, gave their answer, and intimidated the students. So 2 years ago when I did this, I said to my Palestinian friend, let's find a restaurant in Ramallah that is closed during the day, we'll rent out, I said, I'll pay to rent out the restaurant, we'll serve lunch to everyone. We'll pay to have the students transportation. I felt it's not to pay them to talk, but to pay for their transportation, their time and their meal. And I told our group after lunch, and I called up the 5 students to be at the front and sitting, they were all, certainly all under 30 years old. And one of the first questions someone in the audience asked is, what do you think of the BDS movement? Does everyone know what the BDS movement, boycott, divest, and sanctions? And it was interesting what the Palestinian who answered first said. He said, I don't agree with it. He said, he said, I had a scholarship to go to some university, I think it was in Europe. And he said, the people I wanted to meet most were the Israelis who were at the university. And then one woman said, yeah, I'm on Facebook with this Israeli guy, and I like hearing what they're doing. And BDS doesn't allow us to mix or to even communicate with their Israeli counterparts. So, I think there's a situation that these type of things can be overcome, and that the young people really want to just move on and live and go to university. And whether they're Gazan Palestinians or anywhere else, a Gazan who gets a scholarship to come to a university, and many of them do, many universities will give scholarship to them here in the United States. It could be the Israelis, it could be Fatah, it could be Hamas, will often delay them to the point they never get to do the passage to get to Ben Gurion Airport or to the Queen Alia Airport in Amman to come over, and then they lose their opportunity for that scholarship. So I think if there could be more and more Palestinian students who have the opportunity to meet with their Israeli colleagues away from the situation, away from the conflict zone, boy, I think it could be the Dubai that we don't have now.
This has been a very emotionally difficult topic for all of us, and I really appreciate you coming to present to us. I'd like to end the night on a lighter note.
Okay.
Where is your next trip?
Next trip that's going to happen, well, Morocco was to have been now, then I was to have been in Tunisia. We have a Moroccan trip in February that is based around Moroccan culture and Jewish culture, led by a Moroccan Jew. There was to be a trip in February, later in February, to Israel and the West Bank, where I used both an Israeli guide and a Palestinian guide. We still have them on our website. Whether anyone's going to sign up is something I don't know. I hope it changes. I'm hoping to rebook some of these things for late spring or the fall, but now it's anyone's guess. I will tell you, we're doing a trip to Cuba. There's no problem in Cuba.
Jerry will stay around, have some refreshments.
Yes, we're going there. We can go to San Diego. Nico knew his father, but